rally in the Turkish capital, Ankara.
Sıcak bir gelişmeyi Ankara'da tren garına giden köprü altında patlama meydana geldi.
Chance for peace snuffed out by sudden, terrifying
Families of those killed in Turkey's worst ever attack.
Hello, I'm Barbara Sarah, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're tracking this week. Violence in the southeast, a key election in less than a month, and now the worst bomb attack in the country's modern history. The Turkey story gets darker. In the Taliban's crosshairs, the group declares 2 private channels satanic and on their list for elimination. Oil money in Canada's media, it's a slippery slope. And news of the refugees by the refugees for Danish readers. In the past 4 months, since phase 1 of Turkey's general election, we at The Listening Post have returned to the media story in that country more than 3 times. Turkey's media landscape is diverse, noisy, and over the past couple of years has become increasingly polarized and under pressure. This past week, when twin bomb blasts ripped through a peace rally in the capital, Ankara, the challenge of reporting the story was magnified by the tension that's been felt across the media for months now. Authorities were swift to issue orders to news outlets forbidding the publication of pictures of the blast and allegedly instructing telecom operators to slow down some social media sites. There are big stories unfolding in Turkey. There's the battle between the military and Kurdish fighters in the southeast, the airstrikes on ISIL in Syria, just across the border. And then there's phase 2 of a make-or-break election for the ruling AK party. A key part of the electoral battle has been across the airwaves. In the past 2 weeks, there have been more journalists attacked, some sued by the government for their tweets, and a series of opposition broadcasters taken off the air. As Turkey heads for the November 1st elections, the government fight to control the message has intensified. Our starting point this week is Ankara.
Chaos in the capital moments after the deadliest bomb attack in Turkey in decades. News channels around the country were curiously slow to report on the event. The Broadcast Regulatory Authority had issued a notice. The Turkish Prime Minister has imposed a temporary broadcast ban regarding the terror attack this morning, it said. The ban was reinforced 4 days later through a court order. Before the week was out, authorities had launched an investigation against an influential newspaper, Hürriyet.
The first reflex of the political authority is to ban, to restrain the media coverage. They said, well, you cannot air the incident.
Medyada, yazılı ya da görsel medyada saldırıya ilişkin görüntülerin yanı sıra bundan sonra bilgiler iddialarda yer alamayacak.
They said this is a security issue and it was discouraging for many. It's depressing, so stop airing it.
Media freedom is necessary, but families who lost their loved ones have a right to privacy. To me, that's not censorship. Demanding media freedom before families' feelings, to me, feels a bit selfish. It's more important to report facts accurately than rushing to get the news out before other outlets.
Because of this dysfunctional media, of course, young people, especially digitally literate people, turn their faces to social media.
There are around 12 million Twitter users in Turkey, and ever since the mass protests in Istanbul's Gezi Park in 2013, they've had to learn to work around government-imposed bans and restrictions on social media. Twitter's transparency reports have shown a spike in content removal requests from the Turkish government. 718 requests in the first half of 2015 alone. Coming second on that list was Russia, with 68 requests. In the aftermath of the Ankara bombing, Turkish Twitter went into overdrive. The first citizen video of the actual bomb blasts was shared there. That online activity didn't last.
In terms of the power of social media or the influence of social media, I would say that, exception of maybe a couple, most of the TV channels failed in their coverage of going to the sources, making people talk, vox pops, etc., etc. What the social media fulfilled, once more, one could see videos, pictures, people affected, victims, their relatives, giving their voices. This was the efficiency of the social media. Also the tweeting was as usual, very, very effective.
The slowdown began 5 hours after the bombing. I'm a frequent user of the social media, so I was following the news. And 5 hours later, it slowed down. And sometimes it just totally stopped.
This is not the first time bandwidth has slowed down. It has happened during other protests. Twitter was even blocked at some point. So users in Turkey have already gone through this and know how to get around this through VPN.
What's not so easy to work around is TV channels being bumped off the air. On the 9th of October, a day before the bombing, Digiturk, Turkey's largest satellite TV provider, dropped 7 channels from its menu. It cited legal obligations. It didn't say what legal orders it had been given and by whom. 6 of the 7 channels have one thing in common. Their news output has been strongly critical of the ruling AK party, and they've been associated with President Erdogan's former ally turned nemesis, Fethullah Gülen.
Those TV channels which were removed from Digiturk were founded by businessmen from the Fethullah Gülen network. The government can't close down critical Gülenist media. They were only able to remove them from those platforms. It's just another example of what has already happened to critical leftists and Kurdish outlets blocked by the government after the elections on June the 7th.
There have been systematic attacks against certain large media groups in Turkey lately, since June 7 elections. Those attacks concentrated on Doğan Media Group, Koza İpek Group, Samanyolu Group, and those 3 have been put on as prime targets. The reason behind this concentration of attacks is that all of these groups have TV channels. According to UNESCO figures, about 85% of the Turkish electorate, society, gets their news from the TV. The control of the TV is, I think, pretty much key for controlling the crowds and electoral patterns.
In the last few days, I've been hearing a new narrative in the media, saying the bombing could have been in the interest of the HDP, the pro-Kurdish party. So there are reports pointing the finger at the other Kurdish movement, the PKK. I'm 100% sure we will hear more and more conspiracy theories against the HDP and the Kurds in the days leading up to the elections. Because if IS were the only ones blamed, the government would be forced to take responsibility for security failure.
Turkey has become a difficult story to report. In the general elections in June, the ruling AK party lost its majority, and the pro-Kurdish HDP gained unprecedented ground. The politics further polarized national discourse and divided the media. This rift became deeper when military operations began in the southeast against pro-Kurdish PKK fighters. Media access to the battlefront has been limited, and in the last 2 months, numerous critical outlets have been charged with spreading terrorist propaganda.
It's getting more and more difficult. Since last year, journalists have been more or less investigated. Some of them were indicted, and about 10 of them have been sentenced to prison. Many journalists, independent-minded and free journalists, have been fired. The dismissals continue. They lose their jobs, and they cannot be rehired again.
I want to show you a couple of newspaper cuttings to respond to the question on whether or not Erdogan has cracked down on the media in Turkey. This is an ultra-nationalist paper. Look at the subtitle. Dictator Tayyip will account for his activities. And then it reads, "We are calling the dictator a dictator." In a country where media is under pressure, number one, you can't call a dictator a dictator. Number two, you can't challenge them in this way. Then there's this. What does honor mean, Tayyip? They're calling him by his first name. That could be considered offensive. So I leave it up to you to decide whether the Turkish press is under threat.
The split is so wide now, and I mean, I never seen such a hatred among ordinary people in society. Media is amplifying this hatred and intolerance, and it's reached a point where nobody can stand each other.
Other media stories on our radar this week. In Afghanistan, the Taliban has threatened to eliminate 2 privately owned TV channels, accusing them of being American propagandists and, quote, satanic networks. In a statement from what the Taliban calls the Military Commission of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, Tolo TV and One TV were accused of misreporting the invasion of the northern city of Kunduz. The statement went on to declare that hereafter all reporters and associates of these channels will be deemed enemy personnel and will be directly eliminated. One TV and Tolo TV have been critical of the Taliban. Tolo is one of the largest private broadcasters in the country. Its head of current affairs, Lotfullah Najafizada, said, "We cannot allow this threat to set our agenda for coverage in Kunduz or anywhere else. Our coverage will remain unchanged." Nearly 6 months after his trial began in Tehran, Washington Post journalist Jason Rezaian has been declared guilty, but of exactly what, no one knows. Rezaian has been in jail in Iran for more than 450 days. He was arrested in July 2014 and was charged 7 months later with espionage, collecting confidential information and spreading propaganda. In a video on the Washington Post website, foreign editor Douglas Gell denounced the verdict.
This is an outrageous injustice.
The Rezaian family, mother, wife, and brother Ali, have been in Tehran fighting for a breakthrough. They're going to file an appeal. Jason Rezaian has been jailed for longer than any Western journalist in Iran. Last week, we reported on the coverage of Russian airstrikes in Syria, from the critiques in Western media to some of the cheerleading on Russian airwaves. Well, on one TV channel in Egypt, coverage of the geopolitical war games over Syria took a peculiar turn. On the privately owned Sada El Balad channel, the host, Ahmed Musa, aired footage of what he said were Russian airstrikes. Well, in fact, the clip is from a video game called Apache Airstrike, produced by a Russian gaming company. The lack of any geographical markers and the British accented voice in the clip didn't ring any alarm bells for the show's producers or for Musa, who was all praise for Russia's bombing precision.
الروس بيحارب الإرهاب بجد.
Online, Egyptians took Musa's mistake and ran with it, creating a bunch of memes mocking the host. One tweet has a grab from the racing game Mario Kart and says, "Tonight, Ahmed Musa will air a report on Cairo traffic." The station and Musa have yet to comment on the blunder. It's election season in Canada, and the Conservative government, led by Prime Minister Stephen Harper, is fighting for a 3rd term in office. Amidst the political media blitz, there has been a longer-running, carefully strategized media push from one of Canada's biggest, most important industries, oil and gas. The tar sands, or oil sands as the industry calls them, in the western province of Alberta are the 3rd largest proven reserves of oil in the world. Since their potential was first explored 50 years ago, there have been many stories in the Canadian media highlighting the tar sands' environmental impact, greenhouse gas emissions, and safety concerns. But in the last decade or so, oil companies have attempted to counter the negative PR, pouring money into media outlets through advertising and sponsored content. And they've been supported in their media campaign by the Harper government that has pursued a pro-oil agenda. So for every oil story that makes the headlines, many go untold. The Listening Post's Flo Phillips now from Alberta on the Canadian oil industry's impact on the country's media.
The energy that keeps us moving.
When the energy you invest in life meets the energy we fuel.
The energy that brings us together.
We're fortunate to have energy.
The energy that drives our economy.
Canada's energy sector, its oil companies, have bought up a lot of airtime. Their message is clear.
Life takes energy.
It's an ad for the oil companies saying that we are stewards of the land. We promise to look after everything.
We will never stop working to protect our environment, our people, and our communities.
If you look at ads for Greenpeace, you'll see the most grotesque spewing of toxins coming from these refinery plants.
Expanding tar sands production will deepen the climate crisis.
So there's a real dissonance between how the oil companies see themselves and how the opponents of the oil and gas industry want to convey this.
Up until the beginning of this current federal election campaign, I mean, you couldn't pass a bus stop or a subway shelter. You couldn't turn on the TV, you couldn't turn on the radio, you couldn't go to major Canadian online news sites without seeing huge, glitzy, overwhelming oil sands industry propaganda.
Fort McMurray, the heart of Canada's oil industry. As gallons of oil are pumped from the ground, millions of dollars flow into pro-industry messaging across the country. The Harper government's Natural Resources Department spent $40 million on advertising in 2013 and 14. $16.5 million of that was aimed specifically at the domestic market. We spoke to the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, or CAP, who represent more than 200 oil companies. CAP say they've already spent $2 million on ads this year, and that's in addition to the many media campaigns run by their members.
Over the last 5 years, our industry has gone from not advertising or not really communicating at all to being very active in the public sphere. There's been a lot of public dialogue around the oil and gas industry.
There's a growing concern over a toxic spill.
And it's been important for us to get our message out.
There was a time when the Canadian media were able to resist the influence of big oil money and still do their journalism. Today, with many media organisations in serious financial trouble, they've become dependent, some might say addicted, to the revenue from the petroleum industry, which leaves Canadians wondering just how much of the real story gets reported and what doesn't. Fueling the media scepticism are a few conflict of interest cases.
And there is a propaganda war circling the oil sands.
In 2014, it was revealed that Rex Murphy, a high-profile commentator for Canada's public broadcaster CBC, was being paid by the oil industry for speeches at their corporate events.
The people who criticize you, why are you listening to them?
The CBC defended Murphy, saying, quote, "The most important thing to understand is that Rex is not a regular reporter." But that's not true of Peter Mansbridge, the host of CBC's flagship news show.
He spoke to the oil and gas industry and did not say, "You guys are great, you know, keep digging for oil." He talked a lot about the value of public broadcasting and the role of the CBC in the national psyche. He said all the right things. The problem was he took a speaker's fee of $28,000, which leaves the impression that he's the best journalist money can buy.
When you have such an important economic center, the media is going to be influenced by that. There's so much advertising dollars coming from the oil industry into the media, so naturally they don't want to piss off that sector.
It's going ahead with a massive project, and what an undertaking it is.
I think it's safe to say that if you look at most of the reporting, that it's not critical in any great degree of the oil industry in this country.
This presentation was delivered to CAP in 2013. It outlined a strategy for collaboration between CAP and Post Media, a conglomerate that owns 45 of Canada's daily newspapers. According to Douglas Kelly, the Post Media representative, we will work with CAP to amplify our energy mandate. The National Post newspaper will undertake to leverage all means editorially, technically, and creatively to further this critical conversation. We asked Post Media to explain the thinking behind their collaboration with CAP. They sent a brief statement. "We are proud to have CAP as an advertiser. Theirs has been an innovative marketing program across our brands and platforms, which adheres to clear labeling guidelines. There are editorial outliers. Mike D'Souza covered the environment beat for Post Media for 8 years.
If you look at the work I did when I was at Post Media, they gave me enormous amount of freedom to pursue a lot of stories. I don't think anyone would say it represents the interests of industry. If there is a problem in the Canadian media in general, that's, I guess, a problem that has to do with the size of newsrooms and budget cuts. But I was, for the most part, self-assigning, and I could do a lot of interesting stories.
Bruce Livesey has a different story to tell. He put together a documentary for Canada's second biggest private broadcaster, Global TV. The film was on Charles and David Koch, billionaire brothers prominent in US politics, big in the energy industry, and key players in the debate over the controversial Keystone Pipeline running from Canada to the United States. The documentary was pulled just days before transmission.
They made the claim that this story was unbalanced, yet never explained what the other side was or how it was unbalanced. The story had been vetted by a very cautious lawyer, their lawyer. It had been vetted by my boss, who was also worried about it. So the only explanation is that the subject, that it was critical of the oil sands, it was critical of the oil industry, and it was critical of these very, very powerful people. Someone possibly thought this is going to offend advertisers in that rather vital sector, and we can't afford it.
The media in Canada, like so many other places, are in a funding crisis. News outlets, both public and private, have faced budget cuts and layoffs. So the petrodollars that are buying up airtime and print space are plugging a gaping hole.
These guys really did sit down and whiteboard out a strategy, shutting down their critics and just steamrolling Canadians through a massive advertising campaign.
Think oil and natural gas developed the Canadian way is good for Canada?
We spend a lot investing in media relations. We spend a lot in community relations. We spend a lot in research.
And it hasn't worked. Not one new pipeline approved. Massive protests. I think a real credit to Canadians that they didn't fall for this nonsense over the last few years.
Critical reporting on the energy sector is persistent, despite the PR push to counter it. But for some Canadian media outlets, as long as money continues to come from the oil industry, there is always the chance the message could be polluted.
If you want to understand Canada's massive oil and gas industry better, there are a couple of alternative news outlets that our contributors recommended. The National Observer is an online outlet that focuses on energy, politics, and the environment. The site was set up by journalist Linda Solomon Wood to provide a counter to the mainstream discourse on oil and the environment. It has an entire section dedicated to reporting on the tar sands. Next is CanadaLandShow.com. It's a crowd-funded podcast and website that has run a number of stories exposing the relationship between the oil industry and the media, as well as many other investigative pieces. Canada Land broke the story of Global TV's decision to drop Bruce Livesea's documentary on the Koch brothers. Finally, from Lebanon to Germany to Greece to Australia, the refugee story has global resonance. There's been spectacularly xenophobic coverage from certain outlets, but some journalists have crossed borders alongside refugees, and others have live tweeted parliamentary debates in an effort to reflect the scope of the crisis. Well, in Denmark this past week, the newspaper Dagbladet Information handed over the Friday edition to 12 journalists who had come to the country as refugees, most of them Syrian, but also Iraqis, Afghans, and one Thai journalist. Everyone on the team spoke different languages, and pulling together the paper was a feat of journalistic collaboration. The edition was cover to cover about refugees. As the editor said, refugees are statistics, silent extras in the political debate, but in this edition, it is the refugees who will be speaking to us. Well, we went to Copenhagen to hear what they had to say. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
For me, it was an opportunity to return to my profession, journalism. But also, this was a chance to convey a political message, especially to those who believe we don't belong here, that we're monsters.
From page 1 till 48, there was very, very good stories and new stories that I wouldn't have dreamt of reading in our paper. We talked about covering Russia's bombing in Syria in some way. And normally, if we would write that, we will call some experts from some institute in London. But our journalist, Daham, he just called an ex-Assad general, now fighting for the FSA, and makes an interview about where the Russians are bombing.
We published a correspondence between me and my friend in Syria. We found that both of us face similar problems, but in different ways. I suffer from loneliness because I'm living far from my friends. She's lonely too because all her friends in Syria have fled or have been arrested or killed.
We printed a larger edition than we normally do, more than 10% larger. And it was sold out throughout the country before noon. It was actually a collector's piece, people sharing it, saying, I want it back again.
I was very happy about how popular the edition was. Firstly, we were able to make our voices heard. Secondly, this may be a step towards giving others a chance. Not only journalists, but also doctors, lawyers, others whose voices need to be heard so that they can be a part of this society.